Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for the second lecture in our Hayward series this year, which is entitled The Ethics of Nostalgia, Dystopia, Agency and the Future. Our Hayward lecturer this year is Dr. Anna Robbins, who is known to many as the president of Acadia Divinity College, where she also carries the titles and the roles of Dean of Theology at Acadia University. Well, this is a good start. So I'm going to start again. Welcome tonight to join us in the Hayward Lectures. We're going to focus on the second lecture tonight. This series is called The Ethics of Nostalgia, Dystopia, Agency and the Future. I was just about to say, before I stopped and corrected myself, our Hayward lecturer this evening is Dr. Anna Robbins. She is known to many as the president of Acadia Divinity College, and there she also carries the titles and the roles of Dean of Theology at Acadia University. She holds the Dr. Millard R. Cherry Professor of Theology, Ethics and Culture, and she is the director of the Andrew McRae Centre for Christian Faith and Culture. I can say that our son David has other names for her, but these are for him to say and to tell. Anna has pursued her ministry and academic career both in Canada and also in the UK, where she served in the faculty of the London School of Theology for 12 years. I'm familiar that people will know much of her activity here, but it's often interesting for you to check back on her career in the UK to see the ways in which she advised a whole range of people on issues related to Christianity and culture. Last night, we were introduced to something of the presence, the significance, and indeed the commodification of communal nostalgia as a refuge from dystopic fears of the future, with the warnings that the way in which we view the past has implications for living in the present and for the way in which we prepare for the future. The taking of a selfie to record the moment, to look back on it rather than living in that moment. And the belief by young people that indeed the old days were the good old days and things can simply not get better. These were among the moments of identifying something of what is at play here. So we look forward tonight to the second in the series and unpacking some of these ideas. As ever, we invite your questions and reflections in the chat, from which I'll try and gather and garner some questions that we put to Anna at the end. We know from last night people were interested to engage around a whole number of the issues that were raised. So we invite you to do that in the chat as you watch this evening. As we begin, we shall pray together. Let us pray. Almighty God, may we learn to love learning. For the world is yours and all things in it speak, each in their own way of you. Of your mind, your designs, your artistry, your power, and your unfolding purpose. All knowledge is your knowledge. All wisdom is your wisdom. Therefore, tonight, as we apply ourselves to learning, may we be mindful of your presence and of you as the one who has created all things. We pray that through what we learn, we may indeed be enabled to love you and to serve you better. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Stuart. You did such a good summation of the lecture last night that we probably could have saved an awful lot of time and just used that description instead. But I'm grateful for those of you who joined us then and for those of you who are joining us tonight. Remember when Glory Days by Bruce Springsteen was on the radio? Well, at least we're up to the 1980s now. I had a friend, was a big baseball player back in high school. He could throw that speedball by you, make you look like a fool boy. Saw him the other night at his roadside bar. I was walking in, he was walking out. We went back inside, sat down, had a few drinks, but all he kept talking about was glory days. Well, they'll pass you by. Glory days in the wink of a young girl's eye. Glory days Well, there's a girl that lives up the block. Back in school, she could turn the boys' heads. Sometimes on a Friday, I'll stop by and have a few drinks after she put her kids to bed. Her and her husband, Bobby, well, they split up. I guess it's 2 years gone by now. We just sit around talking about the old times. She says when she feels like crying, she starts laughing, thinking about glory days. Well, they'll pass you by. Glory days in the wink of a young girl's eye. Glory days. Glory days. Those were the glory days. Or were they? Well, last night we considered some of the ways that nostalgia may be understood and how a dystopic context drives us towards finding solace in the past. And tonight we will move into the question of agency, exploring the ways that nostalgia drives cultural formations that compromise our agency as individuals and as groups. Very simply, moral agency is understood as the ability of people to be free, to make ethical decisions, and to take ethical actions. If our actions are determined in some way by nature or environment, then agency is compromised. If we're able to reflect on our actions and thereby obtain at least some measure of perspective wider than our immediate context, then our moral agency is empowered. Without agency, we cannot be held responsible for our actions. Agency is therefore essential to a Christian ethic where responsibility stands at the heart of a relationship between people and God. Responsibility further requires agency to not only act, but to act in ways that reflect the image and character of God, and the gratitude of the agent for God's gracious action in history on his or her behalf. Agency is possible even within a narrative frame, as several philosophers and theorists have shown. Agency then may not only be compromised by determinism, but may also be misused and misdirected, aiming at ends that are contrary to God's call and design. I will argue that nostalgia, as prevalent in the dominant culture, particularly consumer and restorative forms, nurtures conditions whereby agency is compromised by determinism, neglect, and misuse. Moreover, it has denied the agency of others who ought to be free to tell their own story, whether nostalgic or historical. In other words, I will argue that being part of a nostalgic culture forms us in certain ways that can lead us to miss out on calls to act ethically in the world, and beyond that, to act unethically towards others who do not share the culture of the in-group by exercising a will to power that is often authoritarian and exclusive. Consumer nostalgia, first of all, compromises agency in that it plays upon the desire for home and directs it to objects that bring us back in time to childhood and youth. Though in some senses is determined by the insidious forces of media and markets, we're nevertheless left with moral and ethical decisions about how that narrative unfolds. Do we remain subject to the forces of the market spiraling ever down deeper into the nostalgic prison? Or do we pursue the grace to push against the numbing effects of a consumer nostalgia that distracts us from our call to be responsible agents in the world? We'll look at that more deeply. And we'll also consider restorative nostalgia, probably better described as restorationist nostalgia, that compromises agency and that it too is in some senses determined by nefarious influences engaging new media. Unsurprisingly, Svetlana Boym has indicated that an atmosphere of nostalgia goes hand in hand with totalitarian and conspiratorial influences. Many are thus drawn into a collective reimagining of home through a nationalist vision that is marked with formative intent and plays on nostalgic sentiments. Nevertheless, we are left with the ability to reflect on our agency through the mechanism of contrast. When we opt to express our nostalgia as restoration, we choose to exercise nostalgic memory rather than historical memory, and exclude participation of others in the national vision that is as eschatologically nostalgic as it is historically so. The invitation to participate responsibly as an historical witness is ever before us. These two forms of nostalgia, consumer nostalgia and restorative nostalgia, parallel Reinhold Niebuhr's understanding of the nature of the moral agent. In his theological anthropology of over a half-century ago, Niebuhr noted the paradoxical nature of the human being. The human being, he believed, embodies the tension between naturalism and transcendence, between necessity and freedom. According to Niebuhr, there are two important facts about humanity, at least two. One, a human being is, quote, a child of nature, subject to its vicissitudes, compelled by its necessities, driven by its impulses, and confined within the brevity of the years which nature permits its varied organic form, allowing them some, but not too much latitude. In other words, we're creatures of nature, bound by our biology. The second fact that he affirms, and Niebuhr calls this a less obvious fact, that a human being is, quote, a spirit who stands outside of nature, life, him or herself, the reason and the world. This is more than the rational human being or even the tool-making human being. This is the quality of spirit that enables human beings to stand outside of themselves and make themselves their own object. To put this very simply and starkly, there are two existential affirmations about what it is to be human. One, we will die. And two, we know that we will die. So we either hide from death and our potential for spiritual knowledge by burying ourselves in our biology, self-stimulation, and escape into the flesh, or we deny that we are mortal and seek to extend our will over others and into the future in a desperate assertion of power reaching for eternity. One response denies our higher spiritual selves. The other denies our contingency as human beings. As human beings, we embody this tension, subject to influences that pull us in one and the other direction. Leaning into one of these responses, rather than embrace the existential tension, either neglects or overextends moral agency through rebellion against God and God's provision for our existential anxiety. We can see nostalgia working out in both of these forms in contemporary Western culture. On the one hand, consumer nostalgia provides the perfect retreat from reality that numbs the moral agent from concern for a wider world. On the other hand, nostalgia provides a memory narrative, a la Ricoeur, for the group that becomes a threateningly powerful political and religious force to restore some notion of past glory or cultural dominance. Agency here may still be at least partly determined, but it bears the force of a self-interested agenda that is prideful, exclusive, and dangerous. So we will spend a few moments reflecting on both of these forms. First of all, consumer nostalgia. Now, in a consumer culture, we have replaced symbolic exchanges of social meaning and culture for signs. That is, the price tags that tell us the value of things external to any social relation. This creates a hyper-reality, something that poses as real, but actually masks the fact that the real has disappeared. Consumer culture masquerades as though it is real, but instead it keeps us distracted in our sin as sensuality, as Niebuhr might call it, so that we fail to notice that the real has gone without observation or protest. We become caught in an endless cycle of seduction and desire whose promises are never fulfilled. The consumer dynamic exacerbates the culture of sensuality where the natural self is coddled or fed without any higher social or religious obligation. Consumer culture creates endless desire, an appetite for more, and ever more with no end in sight. And it is all focused on the self, lost in a world of signs without meaning, lulled into a subconscious existence that becomes a sarcophagus against death, but is death itself. In late consumer culture, signs become separated from the things they were meant to represent. The thing longed for is not real, and a return home is rendered impossible. Home no longer exists, only the image of home, created by the assembly of consumer signs. And since we cannot return home in space or in time, or to who we were in that past, we surround ourselves with purchases that remind us of who we never were, in a way that we never were. There is a Netflix series you might have seen, and the title is intentional rather than ironic, The Toys That Made Us. It's not just the toys that gave us some sense of what it was like to grow up, but they actually in some way came to define who we are and continue to do so. This is the sensual hyper-real. Here the demands of human longing are met with moral servitude. It's a rebellion against the Creator, our spiritual home, and a retreat into the self that leads to an escape from itself. Consumer nostalgia can be understood as a frantic effort to escape the self. It betrays an uneasy conscience. The self is seeking to escape from itself and throws itself into any pursuit that will allow it to forget for a moment the inner tension of an uneasy conscience. as we are convinced that we are free consumers, making choices that create us. We actually are further embedded in a naturalistic culture that determines our consumer choices to the finest detail. Our agency is squandered on purchasing decisions that we think are free, but are thoroughly determined. We think that we can deny the natural from the position of the natural. But if the natural is all there is, then I better do all I can to make it last as long as possible, for death looms. In full escape from the pervasive meaninglessness we've created, we become less than human, hiding in our biology and hiding from it all at the same time. Consumer nostalgia promises home while luring us ever farther away from it. Consumer nostalgia may be defined in various ways. However, common amongst approaches is the idea that we find our identity or tell our story not only through past experiences, but past objects. In a post-war context, we remember particularly the objects of our childhood, the toys, the dolls, the games, and we seek to obtain the most authentic version possible. This recollection may not be entirely negative, suggesting a search at least for authenticity, and it comes with feel-good psychological benefits. We remember these objects and who we were when we had them, but beyond the search lies the realm of the postmodern kitsch, the replication of objects of poor taste, sometimes appreciated ironically, but too often valued for their sentimentality. Robbed of a deeper meaning, they revert to ersatz nostalgia, not filling a void of identity, but creating instead an artificial sign where endless nostalgic desire is nurtured and always escapes satisfaction. Consumer nostalgia escapes from objects and spills over to films, TV shows, and video games. There's money in it, as marketers happily tell us. And so much of the market focuses on an idealized creation of the past and also on the creation of new nostalgias for the future. One imagines the Star Wars Enterprise, and yes, the word is intentional for those who were watching last night. I saw the comments. That was so successful as a marketing phenomenon in the 1970s, and in predicted 20 to 30-year rotation has found a way to emerge and assert itself as perennial through TV shows, spin-offs, and marketing. It will be due for yet another renewed outing in a decade or two, when today's kids are becoming parents themselves. They will not only want to go home to the past, but they will want to take their families with them, setting them up for the next nostalgic generation to return with their own kids in another 20 years' time. In a media-driven context such as ours today, images parade as reality, and truth is a forgotten byproduct of modernity. Here, powerful formations are at work in culture that compromise agency by convincing us we have infinite choice, while all the while shaping our desires and reducing moral agency to a series of purchasing habits. We willingly succumb to this force and drive downward in a spiral of self-serving distraction from the problems of the world that might otherwise demand our attention. Consumerism depends on the creation of an endless desire that is never fulfilled. In endless searching, we spend and spend. And this force is inherent in such cultural liturgies as buying the latest iPhone on its release, gaining a moment of satisfaction, but the satisfaction is fleeting and we seek ever another hit of dopamine. So we turn to video games, Netflix, YouTube, in an endless orgy that never fulfills the inherent desire. Nostalgia pairs with consumerism in powerful ways by channeling our ever-present desire that is part of what it is to be human for a return home and channeling it towards objects or products, movies, games, and so on. Desire no longer needs to be built into a product. Marketers need only create a nostalgic feeling to achieve success, and we leave our agency in the trash can as we log on to Amazon yet again. Thus, multiple ersatz nostalgias are created, and then consumers themselves perpetuate the nostalgic dream. We become ourselves commodified by nostalgia, branded by what we consume and attribute to what we used to consume. Rather than create longing for the past, nostalgic marketing taps into an undirected longing. Industry brands us, writes our nostalgic story, and makes us part of it. This sort of nostalgia is only possible after modernity. The replication of objects on a global scale connects deeply with my personal experience and where I discover my identity in nostalgic indulgence. The idea of global culture made a universalization of the values of human rights, democracy, liberation possible. However, as the division between local and universal has been internalized, instead of aspiring for global values, Boehm tells us the nostalgic creature looks backward and yearns for the particular. Identity itself is found in longing, she says. In a nostalgic age, I long, therefore I am. The homesickness that once drove this longing has largely been replaced by a desire to recover the things and experiences of a novelty-driven consumer society, says Gary Cross. Nostalgia is thus perpetuated. Never being at home means longing is continuous, and the market offers endless distraction from global concern. The nostalgic is never a native, but a displaced person who mediates between the local and the universal. Consumer nostalgia takes the universal and localizes it at the expense of a commitment to global values, not to mention to the neglect of agency to act in response to global problems. The market itself thus regulates the nostalgic agent. The longing inherent in the unfulfilled desire of the market leads to a lingering sense of constant displacement, exacerbated in collective form. And dystopia, remember dystopia last night? You can act or you can hide. The consumer nostalgic hides in a fetishistic desire for themselves and their past. No wonder there is a, quote, global epidemic of nostalgia, an affective yearning for a community with a collective memory, a longing for continuity in a fragmented world. A threat of apocalypse encourages a retreat from responsibility and an assembly of meaning and shared objects. Remember that Rubik's Cube, that G.I. Joe, that Barbie camper? Whether the original joy was real or not, we smile. We feel warm feelings. Whether it was real or not, we remember. Artificial or ersatz remembering created by markets creates the conditions whereby we remember our past and our identity at the expense of others who are excluded from such remembering. Consumer nostalgia is therefore not only inward-looking, it's also exclusive to the in-group or even to the one. As Cross puts it, the problem of forgetting and remembering may boil down to our obsession with our personal pasts, and especially with those moments of consumption of the emerging child or the incipient adult. Well, consumer nostalgia and restorative nostalgia are cultural forms of nostalgia that compromise agency as they drive a narrative formation that either hides from responsibility, a narcissistic obsession with one's own memory of the past, or extends a collective egoism as an expression of political and moral power based on a manufactured vision of a shared past identity, usually of a nationalist kind. And so we look now at restorative cultural nostalgia of restorative nostalgia. In contrast to sin as sensuality and a retreat into the self and denial of a spiritual transcendence that enables moral responsibility, Niebuhr described the alternate collective form as pride, expressed through a collective will to power. When one denies the potential of the moral agent, the other extends it to grotesque extremes that leads to neglect, oppression, and even war. Thus we can see consumer nostalgia as inhibiting agency, while restorative nostalgia stretches and warps agency into potentially grotesque forms. Restorative nostalgia reflects Paul Ricoeur's idea of memory narrative as opposed to historical narrative. I've mentioned this before. Where historical narrative is interested in the recalling of actual past events, memory narrative carries much more of the falsifying narrative within it. It is emotional and sentimental. Quote, it is the promise to rebuild the ideal home that lies at the core of many powerful ideologies of today, tempting us to relinquish critical thinking for emotional bonding. The danger of nostalgia is that it tends to confuse the actual home and the imaginary one. In extreme cases, it can create a phantom homeland for the sake of which one is ready to die or kill, so says Svetlana Boehm. Nostalgia, therefore, is not merely an individual anxiety, but a public threat that revealed the contradictions of modernity and acquired a greater political importance, she writes. Restorative nostalgia serves to extend a sense of collective immortality through a realization of the imagined glories of the past. This is to be understood differently from reflective nostalgia. According to Boehm, reflective nostalgia emphasizes loss and longing and is open to critical engagement with memories of the past. Restorative nostalgics, however, quote, do not think of themselves as nostalgic. They believe that their project is about truth. This kind of nostalgia characterizes national and nationalist revivals all over the world, which engage in the anti-modern myth-making of history by means of a return to national symbols and myths, and occasionally through swapping conspiracy theories. While consumer nostalgia is evident to all, restorative nostalgia is no less subtle, but it masquerades as a social good, while shoring up invented tradition and authoritarian structures in the background. Moreover, it inhibits political action and other social options through technological control. Narratives are created and shared to recruit nostalgics into collective accounts as to why we feel lost at home. These aren't simply shared on media platforms, but through algorithms that are used to control beliefs and behaviors. Books like Your Computer is on Fire and Algorithms and the End of Politics give researched voice to the deterministic control of AI. The use of artificial intelligence to undermine freedom and control the politics of populations is at work to produce cultural nostalgia too, particularly of the restorative kind. Anne Applebaum sees restorative nostalgia at work in Eastern Europe, Great Britain, and in America. Once again, memory narrative supplants historical narrative. She writes, "The nation is no longer great because someone has attacked us, undermined us, sapped our strength. But someone has perverted the course of history and reduced the nation to a shadow of its former self. The essential identity we once had has been taken away and replaced with something cheap and artificial. Eventually, those who seek power on the back of restorative nostalgia will begin to cultivate these conspiracy theories, or alternative histories, or alternative fibs, whether or not they have any basis in fact," she writes. There is a connection to the invented tradition because it is not created ex nihilo, nor is it, quote, a pure act of social constructivism. Rather, it builds the sense of loss of community and cohesion and offers a comforting collective script for individual longing. Despite the social cohesion of shared cultural memory, restorative nostalgia reflects a nostalgia for a transcendental cosmology and a simple pre-modern conception of good and evil. Boehm once again. The conspiratorial worldview is based on a single trans-historical plot, a Manichaean battle of good and evil and the inevitable scapegoating of the mythical enemy. Ambivalence, the complexity of history, and the specificity of modern circumstances is thus erased, and modern history is seen as a fulfillment of ancient prophecy. Home, imagine extremist conspiracy adherents, is forever under siege, requiring defense against the plotting enemy, she writes. It should not surprise us then to see a revival of interest in the Nazi political theologian Carl Schmitt, who argued that we can only build a common identity on identifying a common enemy. We know who we are by knowing what or who we hate together. Restorative nostalgia then is a romantic nostalgia, quote, transformed into a collective belonging that relies on past sufferings that transcend individual memories, unquote. Indeed, in a Western context, such sufferings are more likely to be imagined than real. In such memory, the past becomes heritage rather than history, where monuments to memory are erected and restored. This is distinguishable from the monuments erected in the Old Testament that were set up to remember that the Lord helped God's people and served to remind them they could continue to rely on such help. The erection of monuments to collective nostalgic memory honors the image rather than the real. Yet the stories told about them are treated as more real than the events they represented. Tearing down a monument becomes for some a destruction of the past, rather than a commitment to move on from a specific nostalgic remembrance of the past that may not have been as glorious as we like to remember. Indeed, such obsession with the nostalgic past, quote, reveals an abyss of forgetting and takes place in inverse proportion to its actual preservation. Ultimately, nostalgia is an ache of temporal distance and displacement. As a remedy for the pain of homelessness, nostalgia takes care of both of these symptoms. Quote, distance is compensated by intimate experience and availability of a desired object, such as a monument or memorial, or even a leader to embody and direct desire. Displacement is cured by a return home, preferably a collective one. This is the best part. Never mind if it's not your home. By the time you reach it, you will have already forgotten the difference. What drives restorative nostalgia is not the sentiment of distance and longing, but rather the anxiety about those who draw attention to historical incongruities between past and present, and thus question the wholeness and continuity of the restored tradition, unquote. Those who protest the authenticity of the restored tradition may become the enemy, or perhaps fall tragically and traumatically into the abyss of forgetting through the selective memory of nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia, you see, writes out the narratives of outsiders and others, while the dominant culture makes the other into a scapegoat that shores up their own nostalgic agenda or ignores them altogether, even actively denying the personhood of the other through a denial of their own nostalgic identity. In her recent book, Afro-Nostalgia, Feeling Good in Contemporary Black Culture, Badia Hadlagardi attempts to define and reframe an Afro-nostalgia that is not shaped by white restorative nostalgia. She acknowledges that, quote, the desire to return to a past that never existed is the hallmark of nostalgia. White nostalgia, she suggests, quote, reflects the desire to return to an imagined past of unfettered white supremacy, primarily through rejecting, marginalizing, or erasing racialized others through manifold forms of violence. She sees in the battle cry to make America great again a malignant imperialist nostalgia and white supremacist fantasy. Indeed, here we can readily see the selectivism of nostalgia that whitewashes a past by ignoring the agency of our ancestors and our own continuing responsibility. Hadlagardi highlights the positive psychological effect of nostalgia and attempts a nostalgic retelling of the African American story in a search for identity beyond the narrative of white supremacy. Yet the challenge remains with the dominant culture to realize that the historical past cannot be as selective as restorative nostalgia would like it to be. There has been not only an abyss of forgetting, but false memory has been leveraged to perpetuate violence against those who oppose and protest the veracity of the story told. Not everyone shares the same memory, the same nostalgia inherent in the recollection, remember when? Remember when it was the 50s and everything was good and right, when families were strong and people knew their place in the world? According to Zadie Smith, nostalgia is not a sentiment available to Black people. Hadlagardi puts it this way, quote, for some Americans, evoking the 50s telegraphs a social and political era of white hegemony and power signified by Leave It to Beaver, social conservatism, and the suburban boom. Conversely, for many Black Americans, 1950s America triggers Black and white images of state-sanctioned violence and repression, kitchenette buildings, Amos and Andy, and the innumerable indignities of Jim Crow. Indeed, as she points out, quote, we might also surmise that 18th century white Americans held such a negative view of Africa that they could not imagine Africa as a home worth being missed. We could perhaps say that some felt the same way about Africville in Nova Scotia. Nostalgia functions to compromise agency, both by overstretching the agency of the dominant culture to deny the inclusion of others in the collective memory, and by denying the agency of others by not acknowledging they might have a story of their own, a nostalgia of their own, worthy to tell, that reinforces their own collective identity in a way that allows them to be seen in history and in the present. Building feel-good nostalgia by minority cultures as a challenge to restorative nostalgia of the dominant culture is found also amongst Indigenous peoples in various parts of the world, particularly in Latin America and in Australia. Nostalgia here is pursued as a way of healing, internal to the community, beyond recognition by colonial settlers. Challenging memory narrative with historical narrative then is both difficult and necessary. For in our own pursuit of an ideal past, we carry with us responsibility for those past and present atrocities. Nostalgia inhibits our ability to see things as they were. Quote, the incapacity to believe one's ancestors were moral monsters leads to a rationalization of racism, presuming violence against Black or Indigenous bodies as legitimate. So says Dr. Stephen Ray Jr., president of the Chicago Theological Seminary. We not only inherit the sins of our fathers and mothers, but we continue to perpetuate them. The constant refrain that things were better before is challenged by alternative narratives and nostalgias, and also challenged by history narratives themselves. In her book, The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap, Stephanie Kuntz demonstrates that the way we idealize the past is not reflective of actual conditions and contexts, pointing out, now quite famously, that Leave It to Beaver was not a documentary. She offers a well-researched portrayal of family life that was far from idyllic. Moreover, she shows how the nostalgic myth is perpetuated by modern media. For example, reporting on murders increased significantly when the murder rate was at its lowest in the USA, leading to a belief that things were deteriorating in culture when they were, in fact, improving. She demonstrates how the family has always been diverse and changing, yet highlights that reporting of family conditions is unevenly biased towards problems amongst poor and racialized groups. Often then, when we speak of such matters as historical atrocities, we hold them at arm's length as if such things cannot be true here in Nova Scotia. Things here really were better before. They have always been good here. Or were they? It's fascinating to consider that perhaps these observations apply here as much as anywhere else. The Maritime Provinces manifest a thoroughly, sentimentally nostalgic culture, an obvious fact to anyone who has grown up here or lived here for any period of time. There's an inherent pull to home and a constant remaking of home as memory narrative, often intentionally denying history narrative where it contradicts the desired story that bequeaths our identity. I'm grateful to my colleague Dorothy Hunts for pointing out this book to me. It's just a treasure. In their book, In the Province of History, The Making of the Public Past in 20th Century Nova Scotia, Ian McKay and Robin Bates demonstrate the development of a consumer nostalgia focused on tourism. Tourism is their lens, but it's the same analysis. They show, quote, how from the 1860s in the case of Evangeline, and from the 1920s and 1930s more generally, Nova Scotia became the province of history, the childlike romantic history one might expect in a perpetual playground, in field after field from Evangeline to runic stones to Tartanism. We've discovered a similar logic that can reframe this lighthouse, that first thing, or a thousandth image of Evangeline as classy merchandise in the shop window of Nova Scotia. Everything here is reified. Nothing, not even history, is historicized. All of the ahistorical essentialist talk echoing through 20th century Nova Scotia appeared to recount a history that had actually occluded. Worse, it placed the present condition of Nova Scotia beyond all possible critique, they write. Through invented stories and pan-Celticism emerged the vacuity, they say, into which the self-serious Scottish myth always threatened to collapse at any moment. The progressive colonial view was represented in Reverend Bruce Muir's 1921 vision of a proud statue of Sir William Alexander overlooking Halifax Harbor to, quote, stand forever as a lasting memorial to the man who was a pioneer of colonization of these lands by a healthy, virile British stock. Such a view represents a restorationist, nostalgic view. But this view of history, they say, gave way to the semiotic alchemy of modernism used to convert its position within the empire into misty pseudo-Gaelic nostalgia. Increasingly, Nova Scotia became defined as a therapeutic space, the playground where stressed-out urbanites regained their vital energies, they write. And so we have pandemic refugees from many places moving to Nova Scotia by the dozen to work or retire, never mind the reality of a failing healthcare system. The false innocence inherent in this view, quote, the notion that the conflicts of the 20th century somehow did not implicate Nova Scotia, became a way in which both locals and tourists framed the events of their past. In the tourist gaze, they write, the rules of reality are suspended and those of virtuality apply. History then is represented in nostalgic frame, presenting not only a false view of the past, but inhibiting the recovery of the conflicts and negatives of historical memory. Nova Scotia's, quote, artificial world of museums, Victorian bed and breakfasts, heritage districts, and heritage moments are the loosely historical advertisements for Alexander Keith's beer, all holodecks upon which we can safely play at history. Psychologists may tell us that this nostalgia yields positive feelings of identity, rooted in space and time. And it does. But the reality is that nostalgia, quote, poses no questions, issues no challenges, demands no recognitions, and presents no contradictions. It entertains us with a parade of beautiful objects, but relieves us all of any responsibility to know how these beautiful objects came into existence or why they are dancing before our eyes, unquote. We have been content not to reflect on the realities of the ethnic cleansing of the Acadians in 1755, or the treatment of the First Nations from first contact, or the segregation of African Nova Scotians. Here, quote, history is no longer a root, an inspiration, a curse, or a blessing. It's merely a curiosity, a diversion from real life. History is just something that happened every summer. All of this plays as a consumer nostalgia that leads Nova Scotians to avoid the responsibility that a real history demands. It enables us to enjoy the memory, regardless of how invented it is, and to surrender our agency to know and to act differently. Remember, consumer nostalgia doesn't just present an altered and largely false view of the past, but it inhibits agency, the freedom to recall historical conflicts and inconsistencies, the owning of responsibility, the ability to walk a new path forward. Seeing our history as beyond critique led to a real, quote, disregard for the province actually existing race problem, its segregated theaters, brutally impoverished communities of color, its unresolved questions over native land claims. Beyond mere disregard, however, whiteness often meant the active articulation of an exclusionary concept of the Nova Scotian that worked to stigmatize and critique of racial hierarchy as not one of us. Opting for made-up stories about first arrivals, genealogy, and Celtic legend, we never find out who we really were, or therefore are, as a people. We don't know what home really is. And churches are not immune from this invented memory. My husband Peter and I lived and served in Wales in the mid-90s and into the late 90s, and many stories were told of the priest holes that existed in nonconformist chapels, and we were shown more than a few in the churches where we preached. Elaborate stories were told of times past when church authorities would set upon the chapels mid-service, and the ministers would need to flee through the secret trap doors and through tunnels beneath the meeting house. An adherent in one of these chapels where we preached regularly set about doing some research into these priest holes, and what he discovered led him to conclude that the story was so much better than the reality, that many of the chapels that boasted priest holes and escape hatches were built long after the Edict of Toleration, and in a time when such escapes would no longer be needed. It did not prevent the stories from being told, however, and the stories were reified. It was part of Welsh nonconformist nostalgia. Here on the east coast of Canada, we have our own Christian nostalgias. Many of them are personal and relate to the objects within the church, or perhaps the building itself. Some are community related. We are, after all, storytellers here, and the weaving of a good yarn outweighs the demand for its veracity. We remember our churches as the centers of community, vibrant, full, and welcoming. We struggle to hear the stories of those who may have found them to be exclusive or judgmental. And we are full of nostalgic reverie for family events, weddings, baptisms, funerals, while ignoring the history that excommunicated Silas Rand for advocating so strongly for Indigenous people. We love to visit our local church on nostalgic occasions like Thanksgiving or Christmas for the hanging of the greens, and may feel bereft that the church is closing, though we never darken the door through the year. It's fascinating that recently a program on the CBC radio that colleagues were listening to and brought to my attention, the program presenters were really taking a nostalgic look at the role of the church and community, and they were lamenting its passing and yet celebrating the ways that these church buildings could still be used as something significant at the heart of community without ever noticing that what they really represented had been lost. In Port-au-Pique, during the tragic shooting, it's fascinating that the memorial seemed to take root at the local church, which was disused. A sense then that there is something there still, and yet it is an image only, something that we thought we were hanging on to, but is actually passing away. We highlight our inclusion In the wider Baptist family of Black congregants and ministers, while too easily forgetting that the AUBA, the African United Baptist Association, was formed because of discrimination and racism in the white churches. Hopefully, we're beginning to touch the fringes of recovery of these histories, but our culturally dominant nostalgia is ever before us, seeking to pull us away from embracing the full reality of our past, pulling us ever towards the abyss of forgetting. Moreover, many are drawn into the restorative nostalgia that seeks to make the church great again. We join groups advocating for prayer in schools, as if that practice turned everyone into Christians as we surrendered to the state what was ours to do as a people of faith. We start to seek for a common enemy that will shore up our collective identity, and conspiracy theories run riot. Here in dystopia, we engage nostalgia as a surety of our identity when we feel dislodged and displaced from where we stood before. But is it possible to recover our moral agency in what seems to be a prison of nostalgia? Are we even ethically responsible in the present, given the formative power of nostalgia? Although the sentimentality of nostalgia itself has moral consequences, Avishai Margalit suggests that, quote, we cannot be morally or ethically praised for remembering or failing to remember if history is not under our control, unquote. He believes that despite the power of memory narrative, we are able to recover a sense of agency. Where consumer nostalgia in the church led us to root our identity in objects like packaged programs, brass plaques, and buildings, history nostalgia upholds social symbols beyond signs like the cross and the Lord's table. Keeping the memory of the historical cross shapes us as a living community of grace. The idea of gratitude to God for Christ's sacrifice requires memory of his action in history and of our actions that have betrayed it. Grace and gratitude enable agency, according to Margalit. Reminding us of Schmidt's political theology, he asks, can we form an ethical community of caring without a common enemy, without a foe? Where do we find the contrast in our narrative existence that enables us to balance our necessity with freedom, as Niebuhr posited? MacIntyre suggested a contrast is possible through a comparison of traditions. But Ricoeur helps us further with a largely successful attempt to cohere narrative and norm. Yet Margalit believes that all that is required to achieve agency is some moral imagination. We can form a community of caring so long as we can envisage in our imagination those who are not cared for, those who are left out, those who are not included in our nostalgic reverie. This provides sufficient objectivity to begin functioning as a responsible agent. Not all collective memories are to be trusted, as our study of nostalgia shows. Nevertheless, Margalit reminds us that collective memory has agents and agencies entrusted with preserving and diffusing it. Those who teach us what we should remember and what we should forget requires a moral witness. Now, reverting to nostalgic type, the church may wish immediately to self-identify as a moral witness, but most of the church in the West would have an awful lot of work to do to move beyond nostalgic memory and generate an authentic historical moral witness. Being a moral witness involves suffering, recognition of the other, and a real recollection of history. We cannot be a moral witness so long as our idea of suffering is rooted in nostalgic remembrance of public privilege. Even less so when our solipsistic consumer nostalgia is so self-focused. How could we ever see the other? We cannot begin to contemplate a role as a moral witness without giving voice to and allowing narrations of others to move into a place of privilege as we consider others better than ourselves. Recognizing ourselves in the face of the other, Ricoeur, unites ego and other in moral responsibility. For Emmanuel Levinas, the very presence of the other draws out our responsibility toward and for the other. Recognition is essential. The place we connect with suffering is first of all the cross. It at once breaks out the subjectivity of moral agency by judging all of our pretenses with the holy love of God. It draws out of the self. It draws us out of the self and into the other in fulfillment of desire, our desire for God and ultimately God's holy desire for reconciliation. Here, human beings release their rebellion against God and surrender their desire for being itself. Desire fulfilled sits down at the Lord's table, not to feast and to fill, but to serve. And here, as a witness to Christ's suffering, As a community in the Spirit, which itself suffers, we truly discover the other, not as other, but as oneself, as Paul Ricoeur might say. Here we recognize those in the community who are not us, yet belong to us and to whom we belong. Recognizing the other makes us responsible agents, as Levinas indicates, the very presence of the other drawing out an endless responsibility for their very responsibility. Recollection enables the church to move beyond the memory narrative of nostalgia and to see its place in God's much bigger picture. The church in the West generally, and Eastern Canada specifically, can't just keep generating competing nostalgias. At some point, our nostalgia narrative needs to be challenged with history, and there may need to be repentance. Reconciliation isn't simply generating new competing nostalgias. Rather, it involves a relational process of repentance, forgiveness, and actions of repair. Nostalgia inhibits our agency and misdirects our actions to self and to idols. Walking into a responsible future means recasting our identity in our true home and surrendering our consumer and restorative nostalgic dreams. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to invite people to take a moment or two while I give Anna a chance to catch her breath over there. Invite folks, if they want to put particular questions in the chat, to do so. We are keeping an eye on that at the moment, and hopefully we'll be able to feed some of these to Anna in a moment. I do, however, have one or two things to get her started with when she is ready. And one of the things for you to think about, Anna, as you come to the end of your talk, which we appreciate very much, I want to go back to this question of cultural nostalgia and Christianity. Do you see the existence of cultural nostalgia regarding Christianity as a point of contact or as an immunization against the real thing?
I think people I've encountered, it can be one or the other. I think for some, it's sort of there's a sense that Christianity in this part of the world is latent in who we are, and they like it, they're affectionate for it. In those ways, I think it can be a great point of contact. The difficulty, though, comes in trying to, I guess, explain or to demonstrate the faith in a way that is maybe different from how they expected it to be manifested in sort of cultural niceties of the past, and the nice white clapboard buildings and the nice feelings of Thanksgiving and Easter, to think that it might be something bigger than that, more of that makes a demand, then it might become more like an inoculation at that stage, I think. So probably depends, again, who it is, but there's also, I think, a real positive sense in the first contact, but in terms of moving beyond the nostalgic vision, it becomes more challenging.
So to follow up on that, in this move beyond, you mentioned imagining the other. You mentioned Levinas and the idea of us being torn up in the presence of the other. So how do you see that imagination functioning to enable us to look beyond either a consumeristic or a more restorative nostalgia in the church? Where do we get this imagination from that can empower us?
Well, I'm going to say it again, but tomorrow night I will talk a little bit about that, about how I think it can come to us. But certainly, it's in as much as we can push against always the cultural liturgies with Scripture. I mean, Scripture is hugely challenging. I'm a theologian. I think so much challenge comes from theology of asking people in church, when you sit at that table, is it you and Jesus in the garden? Because that's the nostalgic view, right? That I come to the garden alone while the dew is still in the roses, and it's me and Jesus all the way. And I think that oftentimes in when we're sitting at the Lord's table, which is the place where we ought to be confronted with the other, it seems to me, because at least at the table you're confronted with the other who still yet belongs to you very much in Christ. And so if we have to be challenged in the view of what we're doing, I think that teaching can come at the table, actually. But I understand the challenge that is, because we all know that we sit at the table for a very short time, once a month, but people have those counter formations every day, all day, and culture ends up having the greater say. So do I think it's possible? Yes. Can we gain it? Yes, but we have to spend an awful lot more time, I think, contemplating who is at this table. When we sit here on a Sunday, and I have my little, now in the pandemic, it's even worse. It's a little sealed package of juice and bread. Is this Jesus for me? Yes, but is it Jesus for me and who else? I think that's a huge question to be asking there. And I've rarely been in church when that and who else has been a vision that's been cast, to be honest. And who else needs to be here? I mean, that's kind of the moment where it begins to happen. And I think it has to. But also, I think to create that imagination, sometimes people actually cannot get out of their way of seeing things, because that's the way the brain works, we're told in brain science, right? The neurons line up in certain ways, and the things you've done things before. You're not just a creature of habit, you really are a creature of brain habit. And I think that sometimes going on a field trip, getting out of your situation and seeing people in a different situation who we might regard as different from ourselves, whatever that is, if it's it can be any kind of community that needs to encounter a different kind of community to begin to get a sense of imagining the other, I think. So sometimes you do have to actually physically get up and go and see. And if we're just, and we all see other people all through the week, but we don't think of it that way. We think Jesus is walking with me.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's helpful. That lots of interesting questions coming in now that I'm trying to manage here at the same time. I will do my very best. Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to René Girard? Do you want to go to history questions? which is your preference?
I just whatever's interesting.
Okay, well, there is some discussion in here that came originally. Let me go back here. It was Caro Ann that raised it, and she was asking questions about René Girard's understanding of mimesis. Thank you, and whether you saw a connection between that. Let me give you the exact question here, I hope, which indeed Spencer has been discussing. So it's basically what connection do you see between that idea and what you're discussing tonight?
Yeah, I think there is. I'm not sure that Girard goes in the nostalgic direction and talks more, and I could be wrong, but from when I remember reading it was a few years ago now, that he talks much more about, it's something that's almost inherent in human beings, the violent tendency, and it was Jesus who was able to subvert that mimetic repetition, generation to generation, and he was able to counter it because he completely subverted it by surrendering to it. And I think in that we can find resources for subverting almost any culture, potentially including a nostalgic culture. If nostalgia is about repetition and endless repetition of nostalgia, then I think you could bring Girard into that discussion quite helpfully. And also when we start looking at where I was talking about restorative nostalgia, very much relevant there, because they're always looking for the enemy or the scapegoat. Like who put us in this position? That they're the ones to blame. Let's go get them. And then we see we're just simply succumbing to the mimetic violence that has been inherent through history that Girard so brilliantly describes. And then Jesus offers us really the only subversion of that repetition. It's quite a powerful image that I think is helpful.
I think you have addressed it. Caro Ann's original question was, do you see any correlation between your conception of nostalgic longing and René Girard's mimetic theory of desire?
I think so, yes, in the sense that the postmoderns, and I think we count Girard a little bit amongst those, the postmodern theorists talk a lot about desire. And I think they are talking about probably the same thing. But again, there are multiple definitions for nostalgia, as we've seen. So he has his own take on it. But as he's talking about endless desire is inherent. And I think philosophers have recognized that for a very, very long time, when maybe theologically we haven't quite so much.
And again, I think it's going back to this question of how we challenge or move beyond these negative nostalgias. There's been a number of questions around history and questions about how does history play into this. And so someone has asked, could you say a little more? I'll give you a couple of history questions in case they roll together. Could you say a little more about the responsibility that real history demands? And someone else has said, though, is history not so infected by nostalgia that it's impossible to recover an accurate rendering? And how do we know when the rendering is accurate?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So within a narrative, if you're going to have any degree of being able to break out of entire subjectivity, which I think we have to be able to do if we're going to have a responsible ethic. It can't be entirely subjective, otherwise ethics is merely a description of what I'm doing at any given moment. Then we have to find that objectivity somewhere. Is it an absolute objectivity? I would say not. I mean, and McIntyre talked about, well, we get that objectivity by comparing traditions. So I'll tell the story of my history as a Baptist, you tell yours as a Catholic. We can compare and contrast and learn from one another. You're still, though, closed into a rational cage there, because you're still just simply comparing two different examples of how people live. That's why I think I prefer Ricoeur's approach, where he says, actually, we can step outside of the story and just start to say, well, can you at least describe what happened? And yes, that will be marked by not only, I wouldn't say not only nostalgia, but also by our different memories. We'll have different memories of what happened. But if you can get a number of different stories of the description of what happened, or just even the facts, how many people were involved, you're able then to lift the memory narrative to a different level, so it has potential to become a critical narrative. Do you see? I mean, it can engage it then much more critically to say, well, maybe that wasn't just my experience. If somebody else saw it differently or had a different experience. And I think that as historians, I remember last night there was a question, is Dr. Maxwell going to be made redundant because of that? I think quite the opposite, actually. We have much more need then to address the history of, well, what actually did happen, and to use the questioning, at least, of history to push back at our nostalgic tellings. So that, if we have had this story in Nova Scotia that, nothing bad ever happened here, and I don't think people ever truly believed it, but it's the story that's told. We like to believe it. We need historians to remind us that, I mean, did you see that poster of Evangeline? Come and visit. What a lovely place. Without thinking of the horror of what happened there. So we need historians to tell us the horror of what happened, and to challenge those nostalgic tellings. Will they be entirely true in every sense? Well, we don't think they ever are entirely true, but at least it tells a different angle of the story and challenges these kind of insipid nostalgic renderings, and makes them at least a little bit more real.
Imagination, in a sense, is one of the tools we have to challenge some nostalgic renderings that would take us in the wrong direction. History is another, as it were, voice or place that we can do that. In the church, where would you say, or are you willing to say, where you would see examples of, well, you could do them both if you wanted, either more consumeristic nostalgia or more restorative nostalgia? Where do you see it at play, if you could name it?
Where do I see those two cultural nostalgias working out in the church?
Yeah, showing themselves in the church, in a sense. Because someone raised another question around some issues of the church becoming consumeristic, and whether that was a version of
Oh, absolutely. Because consumerism commodifies everything. It commodifies not only objects, but relationships, people, faith. Anything can be commodified, which means anything is there for your consumption. It's not there for any other reason other than your personal consumption. And so if I don't like this one, I'll go there. If I don't like this pastor, I'll go to another one. If I don't, if I don't like that brass plaque and I want another brass plaque, or whatever it is, we come to church as consumers. And And we all do that. I'm not pointing fingers. We all do that because we are so formed in a consumer culture. We are told constantly that we're the ones who choose. We're the ones who make the decisions about the products and so on in our lives. And so you're empowered to choose when actually it's such a determined exercise. And we go to church in the same way. So I think we've commodified almost every aspect actually of church life. And we see it all the time. We see it in our attachment perhaps to finding the right program, or the coolest youth minister, or whatever that is, right down to something that might seem far more purely nostalgic, but is very consumerist, to say, well, this is my church and I want the carpet to look this way and I want the platform to be set up that way, as if we somehow own it ourselves. That is, again, submission to a consumer culture and a consumer nostalgia. I think it's everywhere in church. Restorationist, you don't have to go too far on social media to find out which of your friends would like to see a theocracy established once again in the land. Not that it ever was one, but longing for prayer back, and I'm talking about Eastern Canadian here. Longing for prayer back in schools, and things should be this way and not that way, and as if somehow the church has some privileged position to maintain vis-a-vis the state, which I think we don't, and as a Baptist, I'm quite convinced of that. Elsewhere in the wider Christian world in North America, it's much more obvious in nationalist movements that have taken hold of Christians and are seeking to direct their desires, in nostalgic directions towards a time when not only the country is great again, whenever that was, but that the church is great again. And it's simply becoming a vehicle for that agenda. But it's everywhere right now, I think.
Okay, thank you. Number of questions now, so I'm starting to pick them up as they come. Do you think nostalgia is a necessary part of, so we spoke about it as heritage rather than history, and the role that nostalgia plays in that. Do you think nostalgia is a necessary part of participating in passing on heritage? And the examples, Jewish culture, invoking the past, efforts to maintain or reclaim language or customs. Does nostalgia, heritage play a valuable role somewhere in there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think much more if we're talking about memory studies, but remember, not all memory is nostalgia. I think it's really important to remember that. Just because it's past and it's memory doesn't mean it's nostalgia. Remember, nostalgia is a painful longing for home, which may be invented and has never existed and all of that, but that's really in a nutshell what it is. Whereas there is memory, there's collective memory that lives and is important to pass on. It can even have some nostalgic qualities depending on where that longing is directed, right? So it's not all negative at all. The ones I'm talking about are negative. These are the cultural nostalgias. It's the nostalgia that's inherent in us. I think it's part of being human, and it gets leveraged in certain directions because of the culture of which we're part. But yes, definitely there are directions that nostalgia can go that is helpful, critical, community building. But even then, I would say it needs to find a conversation partner so that it doesn't become simply restorationist. I think that's almost always the tendency. Our story against somebody else's story, our story, it makes us strong. We are, but for identity of groups who have suffered in history and so on, it can be very powerfully strengthening. And in fact, I mentioned Hayward Lectures, the Afro Nostalgia book. It's fascinating because she says that because of the psychological benefits of nostalgia, groups like African Americans who have been told what their nostalgia is, pictured in history only as, slaves and suffering and so on, she's reclaiming the right to tell a different nostalgia and to tell stories that may or may not be real, but they're true, to show a different way of being that maybe people didn't imagine. And I think we see some of the same thing in some of the African Nova Scotian art around Africville, where nostalgia being reclaimed can actually give a really positive identity to a community who was marginalized previously. I think it's just much more dangerous when it's in the hands of a dominant culture who are looking always to dominate, even if we don't think that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I remember you having a discussion in a previous Hayward Lectures. I think this touches on this issue of restorationist nostalgia about statues and whether or not they should be removed. How does that play into this? Because if I remember correctly, at the time, your argument was that the statues, in fact, didn't reflect history, but they reflected a particular view of history.
Yes.
And it was that particular view of history that was being removed.
torn
I
down.
believe it was you and
That would be in the Simpson lectures, probably. Well remembered.
no, it was Dr.
Oh, was it
Oliver
Oliver
O'Donovan, I
O'Donovan.
think. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
does that connect?
Yes, absolutely. And I did mention the monuments and so on. That's exactly it. I mean, we erect monuments as tributes to a nostalgic memory of some kind. And I mentioned the one that that the Reverend Muir wanted erected over the Halifax Harbor of Sir Alexander. And that was a restorationist view he wanted manifested in that monument. And usually monuments are of the restorationist type, but they can be of a consumer type too, but usually of a restorationist type. And I think about was it the third plinth in Trafalgar Square? It has a constant turnover, and I think that's much more a consumer monument. And people love that one, unless they hate it. It changes, regularly.
Demand almost, yeah.
But other monuments are definitely nostalgic. They're marking something that they want to remember that is not necessarily a true representation of history. And they want to read into that sort of thing. And so I agree entirely that when they're tearing down a monument, they're not tearing down history. They're tearing down the conception of history that projects. And I think it's fair.
Yeah. Someone has asked, in a Christ-centered view, would it be reasonable to say we need him to lead us to salvation from our nostalgic view of history? Or would it be more reasonable to say that we need him, Christ, to redeem our nostalgia? Can it be valuable when tempered with reality?
Oh, I think it can be valuable. In fact, I think it is essential to union with God. I'll follow Lewis a little bit more on that tomorrow night. And it can be properly directed, definitely. And I'll talk much more about what that looks like then. I've been even having new ideas today, which is really difficult because I have to find time to write them in, and I can't do that. But yes, I hope if I don't answer that tomorrow night, whoever's asked that question, if I don't have a better answer for that by tomorrow night, then ask it again.
Okay, well, you heard that. You can bring your question back again tomorrow night, and Dr. Maxwell will be in charge of making sure that is asked again tomorrow night. So there was one here that I thought would be good. This takes us more into the question about psychology, and I remember you saying the recognition that it can be healthy.
Yeah.
Nostalgia. So someone has asked, I'm curious about the psychology of nostalgia. If our brains are hardwired for remembering, forgetting different things, why do we also naturally gravitate towards nostalgia? Is it reaction to fear of forgetting? Is it just to unite people with some sort of shared memory? What's the psychological appeal?
Well, I have to say, I looked at the philosophy and I looked at the politics, and there's so many different angles you can take on nostalgia. I have not read extensively on the psychological take on it. I've read only what a few other people have said about it, enough to know that psychologists do think that it is a healthy thing because it elicits a sense of good feeling. It elicits a sense of maybe social cohesion when we so much lack social cohesion, and that sort of thing. Again, if we're wired to have longing, nostalgia and Sehnsucht, that sort of form, then it would make sense that it would feel good, as well as sometimes feel painful when we're estranged from the thing we're longing for. So I can't say a lot more about it other than the people that I find who draw particularly on the psychological feel-good aspect are those groups who have been excluded from the nostalgia of the dominant group, and they're seeking to recover that for themselves. And I think that's really interesting. And I think we had someone last night talking about in counseling how you use kind of, a nostalgic memory to find recovery. So those are things that are beyond my area of expertise. I wouldn't want to comment too much on them. I'm just aware that they're there. I've read a couple of articles on it. And my pushback would be gentle because I haven't read enough on it. But my pushback would just be, just because something feels good doesn't mean it is good. Not all things are beneficial, says the Apostle Paul. So I that's my one caution when I hear, oh, let's step into this nostalgia. It's really good because it feels good. And then we might then say, well, consumer nostalgia, because it feels good, it's good. And I think there's a lot of questions we would want to raise about that.
Hey, do you have time for a few more? Are you happy to take a few more
Yeah.
questions? Here's one. It says, does the church have an unhelpful nostalgia of the family?
Well, I think that we reflect so much the dominant culture of our age. And so we have been prone to thinking of the family in the same way that it has been, in the post-1950s way across North America, particularly manifested in churches sometimes. And it's when we look at history, for example, such as Stephanie Kuntz presented in her book, we're able to see the evidence actually that all was not as ideal as we thought it was. And so we sometimes set up, maybe I'm way out of touch. It's been a while since I've been in pastoral ministry, but there are people in churches who are just waiting for the families to come in wearing their suits and carrying really big Bibles and kind of making it how it was before. And I kept saying to people even then, that's not going to happen. The people who are going to come through the door, if you've noticed, they're always the people you actually would rather not come through the door. That's when we're confronted with the other. That's when, we start to ask the questions of, does this person belong at the table? And I'll talk a little bit tomorrow night about a particularly nostalgic view that Eastern Canadian churches have of the family. I'll save that one for then.
Okay, thank you. And there are one or two discussions and questions going on about psychology at the moment in the chat, but I'm going to leave them because you said that wasn't primarily the area you wanted to sit in on.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I'll read what they say. So give me your insights, and I'll run with those later.
Okay. In Ecclesiastes 7:10, we read, "Do not say, why were the old days better than these?
Yep.
For it is not wise to ask such questions." What might be some wiser questions to ask? That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, I hope that's a great reference, and thank you for it. I hope that some of the I think the most significant question we could ask, I will ask tomorrow night. But I hope that some of the questions we could ask have been visible till now, which is, were the old days really better? For whom were they better? How can we address the problems created because the days weren't better and it was us and our ancestors who made them not better? How do we face that reality, and how do we do differently going forward? How do we allow the comparison of times to give us some critical insight that we might do differently rather than simply repeat those patterns? Those, I think, are some of the more significant questions. And that's where I started this whole thing when everything kept coming at me. Things were better before. Were they better before? For whom were they better before? Does that mean they can't be better tomorrow? Or what are we doing with that? So I would just always want to just dig into whatever that kind of question is and say, how do we live better today because of what went before?
Here's an interesting one about technology. Do you think theoretical life-extending technologies such as mind uploading procedures and digital immortality appear as extreme forms of humans looking for nostalgia?
I think that's almost an anticipatory nostalgia. It probably has a category of its own, but I haven't named it yet. where it's like the curation of your life that we talked about last night in social media, but it becomes almost an eternal curation. You can perpetuate yourself into the future, and of course you're anticipating that future is when you're going to want to live into. But I think, again, it comes out of the same fear. It's a fear of death, that you retreat into yourself and that you want to live forever, in denial that you are finite. And it seems to me that it's in your recognition of your finiteness, and yet in your spiritual capacity, that we throw ourselves on God. Anything else is a rebellion against God, I think.
Okay, thank you. Okay, one or two more. Here's one that takes us back. Now, I'm reading off my own notes, realizing that I can't spell half the time. So back to consumeristic nostalgia. And someone says, it's interesting that you mentioned dopamine. I've been seeing a lot of videos on social media about chasing the dopamine among younger millennials and Gen Z. How does that fit into this kind of picture? This was back earlier on when you were talking about the more consumeristic nostalgia.
So you mean, how does that...
Seeing this drive, as it were, that's apparent on social media about chasing the dopamine.
But it's an actual thing in your brain, right? There's an actual release of dopamine when certain things happen. I mean, I'm going to go way off. I mean, we're going a little bit off topic here. Well, I might as well go way off. There's one internet phenomenon that I do not understand, but my son's generation, they can't explain it, but they seem to accept it. And I just think it's wacko. ASMR, anyone know what I'm talking about? ASMR? And it's that they have all these channels on YouTube of listening to sounds and people whispering, here's my turtle eating cake. And I mean, it's bizarre. And I don't understand why they spend it's weird. This is my judgment without ever accepting it. It's wonderful for those of you who like it. All I can think is that there must be hits of dopamine that they're getting from it somehow. And so we get these hits of dopamine. We don't have the same natural social relations we used to, even before the pandemic. Worse now. So where are you going to get your hit of dopamine? You're going to get it on social media. Every time someone likes a post, every time you get a thrill out of watching something, you get a hit. You win a game, you get a hit. And your brain gets addicted to it. And again, marketers know this, and they know that we used to talk about how redundancy is built into products and software and so on. They don't even need to do that anymore. They just need to connect in with our nostalgia, and we get the hit. And so they know that that's a marketing win, and we're willing participants most of the time, I think.
Okay, thank you. Okay, final question here. I think we should allow you to have a rest and to wind up this evening. And I hope that we've covered most of your questions tonight. Let's try to pick them up. This is going back to one of particular interest to me in your description of Nova Scotia culture. Tartanism was a great word. Pan-Celticism was another one in there. And I wonder, what do you say to people who would say, but yes, that is my identity. This is my heritage. What advice do you have for those who have heard tonight this story? Nova Scotia means New Scotland, you know.
Yes,
Tina, what is your advice for those who have found this identity issue challenged?
Well, I mean, I love Nova Scotia. And I like all of those aspects of our culture, but I kind of hold them a little bit lightly and almost a little bit ironically. And I'm well over 60% Scottish, apparently.
Everyone is.
Right?
Yeah.
And I can trace me back to the Highlands. Anyway. But it's fascinating to think of how much of the stories were never real. And there was one story told in the book that I mentioned that I just loved, and it was about how one community was fighting to have it recognized that John Cabot landed there in Cape Breton first. And they kept saying, now somebody has to establish that John Cabot landed here first. And the history was a bit sketchy, and so they said, well, somebody just has to declare it, that he was here first. And so eventually somebody declared it, he was here first. And they've since, of course, discovered that he was nowhere near there first. But the legend gets told, and now the history that is almost often told is, well, come and see the museum, come and see he was here first. And we do this up and down the province, all over the place. And commodify those things into their ideal, rather than saying, well, yes, this is a lovely thing, but let's also remember, while we were, well, our heritage was from white colonialism, that there were people who were here before us, actually. And what about their history? What about their nostalgic remembrances? How do we include that? What about, as we said, the expulsion of the Acadians and the suffering that took place? And how are we living that out today? Even if we say, well, I wasn't there, what are we doing about it today? So it's fine if that's who you are, but I don't think that the consumer nostalgic remembrances are always accurate. And I think we have to be honest about that.
And I thank you very much for taking us tonight into this world of consumeristic nostalgia and restorationist nostalgia, and inviting us to think beyond that through the practices in the life of the church as we imagine those beyond the images we create in that, and for a reminder for us to discover again critical voice of history feeding into that. We appreciate you for leading us into that and for answering such a wide-ranging gamut of questions here that I've been trying to keep up with. So we really appreciate the questions that you've asked tonight. It's been very helpful to hear how you've been engaging with it. And we hope that tomorrow evening you will come back. Anna, your third title is tomorrow night. Can we... You don't know? Okay.
It's written somewhere.
It's written down. So tomorrow night we'll pick up on the third of these lectures, and we'll begin to unpack some further themes in relation to this and how we live in the light of that. We do thank you for joining us tonight, and I'm going to conclude with a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Almighty God, take our thinking and take our learning and shape it into who we are in such a way that enables us to love you, our God, with all our heart and soul and mind, and indeed our neighbour as ourselves. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.